I am Riley, 34 years old, and a senior forensic accountant in Chicago. I need a new car, and you have to co-sign. My older brother Chase texted me at 11:30 last night. I replied with two simple words, dream on. 15 minutes later, my mother Patricia texted, if you refuse, you are cut off from family events. I did not shed a single tear. I just picked up my phone, dialed Chase Bank, and formally removed myself as the guarantor of our shared family credit line. By 9 o'clock this morning, I had 56 missed calls. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to set a hard financial boundary with a toxic family member. Growing up in a wealthy Chicago suburb, my parents Patricia and Richard made the rules perfectly clear. Chase was the charismatic genius, destined for greatness as a venture capitalist, while I was just the boring number cruncher. They expected me to remain quietly in the background, a convenient safety net for his reckless spending. But as a certified fraud examiner, I knew exactly what happened when you let a financial parasite dig too deep. At 1 minute past 9 this morning, my phone vibrated across my desk for the 57th time. The caller ID flashed the name of my mother. I took a slow sip of my coffee and answered. Riley, you need to get down to the luxury dealership right now! Patricia shrieked into the receiver. Her voice was shrill with panic, a sound I rarely heard from the country club socialite. They are holding your brother in the finance manager's office and threatening to call the police. I kept my voice completely flat. Why would they call the police over a car loan, Mom? She let out an exasperated sigh. Do not play stupid with me, Riley. Chase went to lease the new vehicle this morning. He gave them your social security number to push the paperwork through as a co-signer. The finance guy ran the application, but the system flagged it for fraud because you canceled the shared family credit line last night. I leaned back in my ergonomic office chair. So let me get this straight. My 35-year-old brother tried to forge a luxury car lease using my identity without my presence, and the dealership caught him committing felony identity theft. And somehow this is my fault, Patricia gasped dramatically. He just needed your social security number to push the paperwork through. You are a boring accountant with an 800 credit score who never buys anything but groceries. Why are you so selfish? He is your brother. We have a dinner party tonight to celebrate his new logistics company, and he needs that car for his public image. An image built entirely on my dime, I noted silently. For the past 3 years, my parents had guilted me into co-signing a massive revolving credit line under the guise of family loyalty. Chase drove leased luxury vehicles, wore expensive suits, and burned through cash on phantom business ideas, while I lived in a modest apartment and maxed out my retirement contributions. They assumed my quiet lifestyle meant I owed them my financial stability. They were very wrong. Mom using another person's social security number without authorization is a federal crime, I replied calmly. The algorithm flagged his application because I completely severed my financial ties to this family at midnight. Chase is on his own. I am not coming down there, and I am not rescuing him from his own massive stupidity. Patricia began to hyperventilate on the other end of the line. Your father and I are driving to the dealership right now with our checkbook. You have ruined his morning, Riley. You are tearing this family apart over a piece of plastic. I will never forgive you for doing this. I ended the call without another word. The silence in my office was absolute and deeply satisfying. I placed my phone face down on the polished wood of my desk. The toxic dynamic had finally been severed, but my relief was incredibly short-lived. My computer screen lit up with a high-priority notification. It was an automated alert from the premium credit monitoring service I maintained for my personal accounts. 5 new hard credit inquiries had just been flagged under my social security number. They originated from 4 different commercial banks and 1 private lending firm. This was not just about a luxury sports car. Chase had been extremely busy while I was sleeping. As an auditor, my instincts immediately took over. I opened a new secure browser window and logged directly into the Federal Credit Bureau portal to pull my comprehensive background report. I needed to see exactly how much damage my brother had attempted to inflict on my pristine financial record. What I discovered staring back at me from the glowing monitor made the blood freeze in my veins. Chase had not merely applied for a vehicle loan this morning. He had submitted multiple applications for massive commercial loans designed to fund his non-existent logistics empire. My brother was attempting to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars in my name. The battle lines had just been drawn, and my family had absolutely no idea what kind of war they had just started. I took a deep breath, letting the cold reality settle over me. The time for being the quiet, compliant daughter was over. I was officially stepping onto the battlefield, fully prepared to destroy the golden child my parents worshipped. They thought they could bleed me dry and throw me away when I stopped being useful. They assumed I would surrender silently to protect their precious public image. Instead, they were about to learn exactly why you should never ever declare war on the senior family accountant. I pulled open the heavy wooden door, expecting to see my father storming back to hurl another hollow threat. Instead, I found Nia standing in the dimly lit hallway. My sister-in-law looked immaculate, as always, wearing a tailored charcoal pantsuit that probably cost more than my entire furniture collection. She held a thick manila folder in her left hand and a bottle of 20-year-old Pappy Van Winkle bourbon in her right. Her dark eyes swept over my shoulder, assessing the empty living room before locking onto my face. My sister-in-law did not wait for an invitation. Naya stepped past me into the entryway, bringing the sharp scent of expensive sandalwood and an aura of absolute war. She was not playing the doting, supportive wife tonight. She walked straight to my kitchen island, set the heavy manila folder down with a loud thud, and retrieved 2 crystal tumblers from my open shelving. She popped the cork on the bourbon and poured 2 generous measures, sliding 1 glass across the granite counter toward me. "Drink," she commanded softly. "You are going to need it." I took a slow sip, letting the deep burn ground me after the chaotic confrontation with my parents. "What is going on, Nia?" "I am filing for divorce," she announced plainly, taking a slow sip of her own drink. "I am a corporate real estate broker, Riley. My entire career is built on assessing risk-validating assets and tearing apart fraudulent property claims. For the past 6 months, Chase has been acting increasingly erratic. He comes home at 3 in the morning, smelling like cheap perfume and panic. He brags about venture capital returns while asking me to cover our mortgage. I got tired of the excuses and the gaslighting. I decided to run a comprehensive background check on our marital assets to prepare for a clean split. What I found was a financial massacre. She tapped a manicured finger against the manila folder. I opened the flap and pulled out a thick stack of banking records, tax returns, and corporate filings. I bypassed the summary pages and went straight to the business registrations. Chase registered a limited liability company called Apex Global Logistics 2 years ago. Naya explained, watching my eyes dart across the balance sheets. He told me it was a boutique freight forwarding service. He claimed he secured seed funding from private angel investors who believed in his vision. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the signature line on the Federal Small Business Administration loan application. The document authorized $250,000 to be deposited into the operating accounts of Apex Global Logistics. The primary guarantor listed on the loan was not Chase, it was me. "He forged my signature," I whispered, tracing the blue ink with my index finger. The handwriting was a near-perfect replica of my own. He used my social security number to secure the loans for a ghost company. Nia leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "It is worse than that. Apex Global Logistics does not own a single truck. They do not have a payroll. It is a shell company, Riley. A complete ghost. He has been systematically draining that loan money into offshore accounts and using the remnants to fund his lifestyle and his mistress. When the federal funds started running dry this month, he panicked. He needed liquid capital to maintain the illusion of success. That is why he got sloppy at the dealership today." I flipped to the next page. Wire transfer receipts routed thousands weekly to a fake boutique marketing firm. It was a luxury high-rise condominium downtown. He was paying his mistress rent with the money he stole using my identity. I felt a sickening wave of betrayal, followed instantly by a surge of pure rage. My parents had stood in this exact spot 30 minutes ago, looking me dead in the eye and demanding I sign away my future to protect this specific lie. Richard had clearly seen these documents, or at least enough of them, to know his son was facing federal prison. They chose him. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. The 5 hard credit inquiries I saw this morning were not random applications. He was trying to open new commercial lines of credit under my name to pay the interest on the fraudulent loan before the federal government realized they were funding a phantom corporation. If I had signed that release of liability an hour ago, I would have legally accepted responsibility for the stolen federal funds. Richard and Patricia knew exactly what they were doing. They were fully prepared to sacrifice my freedom to keep their son out of a federal penitentiary. I looked up from the documents, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. Why bring this to me, Nia? You have enough evidence right here to destroy him in divorce court. You could walk away clean. Nia finished her bourbon and set the glass down with a sharp click against the granite. Because walking away clean is not enough, she said, her gaze turning ruthless. Chase spent 5 years gaslighting me, diminishing my career and using my income to subsidize his delusions of grandeur. He thinks because I am a black woman operating in a white male-dominated industry, I will just quietly accept the settlement to avoid a public scandal. He thinks I am too concerned with my professional reputation to drag him through the mud. She leaned across the island, her eyes burning with a fierce, brilliant intensity. I am going to take his pride, Riley. I am going to expose his fake empire to every single venture capitalist in this city. I am going to leave his social reputation in absolute ruins. But tracing the offshore accounts, piercing the corporate veil of his ghost companies, and legally seizing the assets he hid in the Cayman Islands requires a level of forensic accounting expertise I do not possess. I can ruin his name, but I really need a certified fraud examiner to take his money. Nia tapped the fraudulent loan application bearing my forged signature. They tried to turn you into their collateral damage, she stated softly. They tried to bury you under his debt so he could keep playing king of the world. I am offering you the shovel to dig his grave instead. So what do you say? Are you in Esses? I did not even hesitate. I pulled my high-performance auditing laptop from my work bag and slammed it onto the granite island. Pass me the banking schedules, I said. Nia smiled a sharp, predatory grin and slid the stack of documents across the counter. For the next 8 hours, my kitchen transformed into a war room. We operated in a state of hyper-focused synchronicity fueled by 20-year-old bourbon and an unspoken shared desire for absolute destruction. Nia provided the commercial real estate listings, the lease agreements, and the property tax records. I fed those data points into my forensic algorithms, tearing apart the corporate veil of Chase Alexander. The digital paper trail was a masterclass in arrogance. Chase had structured Apex Global Logistics with the sloppy confidence of a man who had never faced a single consequence in his entire life. He routed the federally backed loan money through 3 different shell companies registered in Delaware. I tracked the routing numbers, bypassing his primitive attempts at masking the transfers. I watched the money flow outward in real time. Thousands of dollars funneled to high-end jewelers' luxury car leases and the downtown condominium where his mistress lived. But as I mapped the cash flow matrix, a glaring anomaly appeared on my screen. Apex Global Logistics was bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate, but the primary operating account never dipped below the minimum threshold required to trigger an automatic bank audit. Someone was injecting targeted bursts of cash into the shell company at the end of every month. I ran a reverse trace on the incoming wire transfers. They originated from a domestic revocable trust. Look at this, I said, pointing to the glowing monitor. Someone is floating his ghost company to keep the federal lenders off his back. Nia leaned over my shoulder, her eyes scanning the routing data. Her posture went completely rigid. I recognized that routing number, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. That is your parents' primary retirement account. I set up the escrow transfer for their summer home using that exact account 2 years ago. I felt the blood drain from my face. I rapidly cross-referenced the trust documents with the incoming transfers. Nia was absolutely right. Patricia and Richard were not just protecting their son from a minor misunderstanding at a car dealership. They were active co-conspirators in a federal fraud scheme. For the last 6 months, my parents had been quietly liquidating their retirement portfolio, transferring tens of thousands of dollars into a fake logistics company to cover up Chase's massive financial losses. They were draining their own life savings to prop up his illusion of success, ensuring Nia never suspected a thing. They are funding the fraud I stated, the cold reality settling over me. They knew he was stealing. They knew he was failing. They chose to bankrupt themselves to protect his image. If they intertwined their personal retirement trust with a fraudulent corporate entity, then their historical ledgers are fair game for this asset trace. I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Let us see exactly how long they have been covering his tracks. I bypassed the current fiscal year and commanded the software to pull a full 10-year transactional history of my parents' trust account. The screen populated with thousands of line items. I filtered the data specifically looking for large, unexplained capital transfers to any entity associated with my brother. The search results generated instantly. I stopped breathing. There was a specific wire transfer initiated exactly 5 years ago. The dollar amount was precise down to the cent. $84,520. The destination was an enterprise called Nexus Tech Solutions. It was Chase's very first tech startup, the one that spectacularly folded after just 3 months. My vision blurred as a memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was 18 years old, sitting in my parents' formal living room, clutching my college acceptance letter to Chicago booth. Richard had paced the room with a somber expression while Patricia dabbed at her dry eyes. Richard had told me that the delayed ripples of the housing market crash had completely wiped out my college savings plan. He claimed the money was gone, evaporated into the volatile market. He told me I would have to take out predatory high-interest student loans to fund my own education because the family simply could not afford to help me. I had spent the next 5 years working 2 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night, and eating instant noodles to pay for my degree while carrying crushing debt. The money never evaporated in a market crash. The exact balance of my college fund had been wired directly into Chase's failing startup on the exact same day Richard told me I was on my own. My parents had stolen my entire future to fund their golden child's reckless vanity project. I sat back in my chair staring at the damning line of data. The last lingering shred of familial loyalty I possessed withered and died in that exact moment. They did not just favor him, they actively cannibalized me to sustain him. We are taking everything I said to Nia. We are taking every single cent. Dawn began to break, casting a pale blue light through my apartment windows. The kitchen island was covered in highlighters, legal pads, and undeniable proof of multiple federal crimes. We had him. We had all of them. The trap was fully constructed. Suddenly, my cell phone vibrated violently against the granite counter, shattering the early morning silence. I glanced at the caller identification. It was Arthur Vance, the senior managing partner at my forensic audit firm. Nobody from the executive suite called at 6 in the morning unless the sky was falling. I answered the call, keeping my tone professional. "Good morning, Arthur. Riley, pack a bag and get moving." For 3 weeks, I lived out of a corporate hotel suite, leading a team of forensic auditors through the shattered remains of Apex Global Logistics. Armed with a federal mandate and the full backing of the National Bank, I traced every stolen dollar across 5 continents. I mapped the offshore accounts, identified the shell companies, and handed the thoroughly documented fraudulent enterprise directly over to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, the trap was not just set, it was completely sealed. Dinner at my parents' gated estate in the northern suburbs was a masterclass in performative wealth. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. Inside the sprawling mansion, the dining room table groaned under the weight of catered food and crystal glasses. I walked through the double mahogany doors wearing a simple tailored dress and an armor of absolute certainty. The air smelled of roasted turkey sage candles and unspoken tension. Nia was already there playing the devoted, adoring wife with terrifying perfection. She floated through the living room in a stunning emerald gown, laughing at Richard's terrible jokes and resting a manicured hand on Chase's shoulder. Chase looked haggard. The stress of the collapsing loans and the drying up of his stolen capital was eating him alive. He kept checking his phone, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes darting toward the door. He had no idea the bank had caught on. He had no idea his own wife had handed me the map to his destruction. He just knew the money had stopped flowing. When we took our seats in the formal dining room, the atmosphere shifted from falsely festive to heavily suffocating. Patricia sat at the head of the table, radiating icy disapproval. She had not spoken to me since I shredded their deceptive legal document in my apartment. She picked up her crystal flute of champagne and tapped it sharply with a silver spoon. The ringing sound silenced the room immediately. "I would like to make a toast," Patricia announced, her voice projecting with practiced theatricality. She stood up, smoothing her silk dress, and locked her gaze directly onto me. Her smile was sharp and completely devoid of warmth. "To family, true family. In a world full of selfishness and individual ambition, we must remember that loyalty is the only currency that truly matters. When times get difficult, you find out exactly who is willing to sacrifice for the greater good of this family, and who is simply out for themselves. Let us be thankful for those who protect our legacy and pray for those who lack the moral fortitude to understand what family loyalty actually means." Richard raised his glass in solemn agreement. Chase offered a tight, arrogant smirk. Nia caught my eye and took a deliberate sip of her wine, hiding a razor-sharp smile behind the rim of her glass. I raised my own glass. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I drank to their impending ruin. The moment dinner concluded, Chase cornered me. I walked into the massive chef kitchen to drop off my dessert plate when he followed me inside. He moved with a sudden burst of energy, shutting the heavy wooden door behind him and locking it with a sharp click. The ambient noise of the dinner party vanished, leaving us in sudden hostile silence. He stepped into my personal space, forcing me backward until my spine hit the cold stainless steel of the refrigerator. Chase was 6'2", playing off his physical size to intimidate me like Richard always did. He braced both hands on the counter beside me, effectively caging me in. "You think you are so smart, Riley?" He hissed, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. "You think shredding that form made you untouchable? You think you can just walk away from this family when I need you?" I kept my expression entirely neutral. "I did walk away, Chase. You are the one blocking the door." His face flushed a dark, angry red. "You are going to fix this," he demanded, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "The lenders are calling my cell phone every single hour. My commercial credit lines are completely frozen. You are a senior forensic accountant. You know how to manipulate the ledgers. You are going to log into the portals, create a restructuring plan, and shift the liability away from Apex. You are going to sign the proxy documents Richard sent you. And if I refuse," I asked, my voice perfectly calm. Chase leaned in closer, his eyes wide and frantic. "Then I ruin you. I have already drafted a formal complaint to the state CPA licensing board. I am going to tell them that my sister, the brilliant senior auditor, actively advised me on how to evade federal taxes. I will claim you masterminded the entire corporate structure of Apex Global Logistics. I will say you instructed me to commingle those funds to hide assets. It will be my word against yours, and I have the emails showing you had access to my business plans. The board will suspend your license pending a full federal investigation. You will lose your job, your reputation, and your precious little apartment. You either save my company tonight, or I take you down with me." He smiled a nasty, triumphant smirk, entirely convinced he had just played a winning hand. He expected me to crumble. He expected the quiet, compliant sister to surrender to the threat of professional annihilation. Instead, I let out a slow, soft laugh. I lifted my left wrist. I tapped the glowing screen of my Apple Watch. The red recording icon vanished as I hit the stop button. I saved the audio file directly to my secure cloud server. "Send the complaint, Chase," I said, looking up into his terrified eyes. Send it to the board. But you might want to check the mailbox first. The IRS sent you a little holiday greeting. Chase stumbled backward, his shoulder hitting the stainless steel refrigerator with a dull thud. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a panicked child. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I did not wait for him to find his words. I simply turned the handle of the heavy wooden door, unlocking it, and walking back into the formal dining room as if nothing had happened. The contrast between the cold reality of the kitchen and the warm, artificial glow of the dining room was jarring. The extended family was completely oblivious to the financial slaughter unfolding right beneath their noses. My aunts and uncles were passing crystal bowls of cranberry sauce and laughing at a story my cousin was telling. I took my seat next to Nia, who gave me a microscopic nod of acknowledgement. She picked up her wine glass, swirling the dark red liquid with absolute calm. A moment later, Chase walked back into the room. He looked physically ill. He sank heavily into his chair at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, staring blankly at his half-eaten plate of turkey. Richard noticed his son's distress immediately. My father cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive silk tie, and adopting the benevolent patriarch persona he loved to project for an audience. He tapped his knife against his water glass, drawing the attention of the entire table. "It seems we have a little tension tonight," Richard announced, projecting his voice so every relative could hear. The room quieted down. The clinking of silverware stopped. Richard looked directly at me, his eyes hard and uncompromising. "Riley, I know you have been dealing with some personal frustrations lately at your firm. We all know how stressful the accounting world can be for you. But taking your stress out on your brother is unacceptable. Chase has been working around the clock to build his logistics company, and he does not need your negativity weighing him down." I placed my fork down on the pristine white tablecloth. I kept my posture perfectly straight. "I am not taking anything out on him, Richard," I replied evenly. "Do not use that tone with me." Your father warned, his voice dropping an octave. "We are a family. We support each other. You have been increasingly hostile and difficult ever since Chase tried to include you in his vehicle lease. I want you to apologize to your brother right now. We need to keep this family whole, and I will not allow your bitter attitude to ruin our Thanksgiving dinner." The extended family shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were used to my parents publicly reprimanding me, but demanding a formal apology in the middle of a holiday dinner was extreme, even for Richard. "I am not apologizing to a criminal," I stated, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. Patricia slammed her hands down on the table so hard the crystal wine glasses trembled. Her perfectly manicured facade shattered instantly. She leaned forward, her face contorted with pure, unfiltered rage. "How dare you!" Patricia screamed, her voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceiling. "You are a jealous, bitter spinster, Riley. You have absolutely nothing. You sit in your tiny apartment crunching numbers while your brother is out building an empire. You are furious because you will never have his success. You will never have a beautiful marriage like he has with Nia. You are desperately trying to drag him down to your miserable level because you cannot stand seeing him shine." The silence that followed her outburst was absolute. Nobody breathed. My Aunt Martha stared at her plate. Chase kept his eyes squeezed shut. Nia took a slow, deliberate sip of her Cabernet. She set the glass down on a silver coaster. The soft clink sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Speaking of jealousy," Patricia Nia said, her voice smooth, conversational, and utterly devastating. "I noticed the estate tax on this house has not been paid this year. Curious, since you just took out a $400,000 home equity line of credit on it." The entire table froze. Richard dropped his heavy silver fork. It clattered loudly against his fine china plate. The color drained from his face, matching his son's terrified pallor. Nia did not stop. She leaned back in her chair, looking at her mother-in-law with a predator smile. "I ran the property records this morning, Patricia. You and Richard leveraged this entire estate to the absolute maximum limit. You mortgaged the family home to cover Chase's margin calls. You bled your retirement dry, and then you borrowed against the very roof over your heads to keep his fake logistics company afloat. You hid his losses from me, from the rest of the family, and from the federal government. Richard opened his mouth to defend himself, but a harsh, wet cough was all that came out. The illusion of the wealthy, successful patriarch evaporated in an instant, leaving behind a desperate old man drowning in debt. The extended family members exchanged horrified, bewildered glances. The perfect facade of the golden child and the wealthy parents was burning to the ground right in front of their eyes. Patricia clutched her chest, gasping for air, as if Nia had physically struck her. "That is a lie," she gasped, looking wildly around the table. "Richard, tell them it is a lie." Richard could not even look at her. I stood up slowly, pushing my heavy wooden chair back. I smoothed the front of my dress and looked down at my parents. The sheer absolute fear in their wide eyes was completely intoxicating. "And since you foolishly linked that HELOC to the shared family credit line I just canceled," I stated, my voice carrying the cold weight of an executioner, "the bank is initiating a full manual review. Your precious luxury mortgage is going into default tomorrow morning." The silence in the dining room hung so heavy, it felt as though the air had been violently vacuumed from the estate. Aunt Martha was the very first to move, pushing her chair back with a loud, abrasive scrape against the polished hardwood floor. She did not say a single word. She simply gathered her expensive cashmere wrap and walked purposefully toward the grand foyer. That single decisive movement shattered the paralyzing spell. The rest of the extended family immediately followed her lead, avoiding eye contact with my parents and scrambling frantically for their coats. Hushed whispers ignited into frantic gossip before the heavy oak front door even closed behind them. Patricia stood paralyzed at the head of the table, her mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. The pristine social facade she had spent 4 decades meticulously constructing was disintegrating in real time right in front of her peers. By tomorrow morning, her exclusive country club friends would know every sordid detail. They would know the grand matriarch of the Alexander family was not a wealthy philanthropist, but a desperate fraudster facing imminent foreclosure. Richard remained slumped in his chair, his face buried deep in his trembling hands. Chase looked frantically between his parents and his wife, hoping someone would tell him this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Nia simply dabbed her lips with a linen napkin, stood up, and gracefully exited the room, leaving the three of them completely alone in the smoking wreckage of their own making. I walked out into the crisp November air, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation. The cold wind felt incredible against my skin. The toxic loyalty that had bound me to this family was finally severed forever. The real panic began exactly 72 hours later. At precisely 9 o'clock on Monday morning, the automated banking systems executed their programmed directives. I was sitting at my desk at the forensic firm, nursing a hot coffee, when my secondary monitor lit up with the internal alerts. Chase tried to swipe his platinum corporate card at a luxury coffee shop downtown. The transaction was instantly declined. He immediately logged into his banking portal, only to find a bold red banner blocking his access. His commercial credit lines, his checking accounts, his offshore routing portals, everything was officially locked tight. His frantic panic was predictable, but the swiftness of the federal banking regulations was absolute and unforgiving. Across the city, in their lavish suburban mansion, Patricia and Richard were experiencing their own customized financial nightmare. Richard dialed his senior wealth manager at the private bank, a man he had golfed with for 15 years. He expected a quick override, a friendly favor to clear up a minor clerical error. Instead, he was routed directly to the Legal Compliance Division. A junior compliance officer informed my father that his entire asset portfolio, including the trust, the home equity line of credit, and his remaining retirement funds, was entirely frozen. The bank was executing a mandatory asset hold pending a federal fraud review initiated by the Internal Revenue Service. They were legally prohibited from dispersing a single cent to him. Patricia tried to use her personal cards to book a panicked flight to their summer home, only to find those accounts permanently suspended as well. The complicated web of financial interdependence they had used to fund Chase's illusions had effectively trapped all of them in the exact same cage. They had zero liquidity. They had no access to their emergency reserves. They were completely financially paralyzed. By noon, my phone began to vibrate relentlessly against the surface of my desk. The Alexander family group chat, an endless stream of mundane updates and performative holiday planning, had transformed into a digital war zone. My screen filled with rapid-fire messages, each one more desperate and vicious than the last. Chase sent the first volley, accusing me of destroying his livelihood out of pure spite. He typed in all caps demanding to know what I had done to his corporate accounts. Patricia quickly followed, shifting the blame entirely onto my shoulders. She accused me of being a traitor, claiming I had orchestrated this entire disaster because I could not handle seeing my brother succeed. Richard chimed in, attempting to command authority through aggressive text messages. He ordered me to fix the situation immediately. He told me to call my managing partners to leverage my connections at the auditing firm and to clear Chase's name before the federal investigators dug any deeper. They genuinely believed I still cared about their approval. They thought they could bully me into covering up their federal crimes, just like they had bullied me into giving up my college fund. The messages kept pouring in without pause. Patricia told me I was dead to her if I did not make the bank lift the holds. Chase threatened to drive to my office and drag me out of the building. Richard insisted that family loyalty required me to sacrifice my professional ethics to save his legacy. They demanded I use my insider knowledge to erase the digital paper trail. They wanted me to rewrite history. They wanted me to save them from the exact consequences of their own actions. I sat in my quiet office, watching the text bubbles populate on my screen. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I felt absolutely nothing for these people. I watched the frantic digital panic unfold, reading every demand and every threat with complete emotional detachment. I waited until the barrage of messages slowed to a nervous halt. They were waiting for my surrender. They expected the compliant daughter to finally crack under the weight of their collective anger and step in to clean up their mess. I picked up my phone and opened the keyboard. I typed out my final message to the Alexander family, checking my spelling before hitting send. I cannot. I am the lead auditor assigned to the case. Conflict of interest. Good luck. I locked my phone, dropped it into my desk drawer, and turned back to my monitors. The asset seizure forms were waiting for my signature. Tuesday evening brought a torrential downpour to the city, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the ambush waiting in my hallway. I had just finished reviewing the preliminary asset seizure reports for the Internal Revenue Service when heavy, aggressive knocking rattled my apartment door. I checked the security monitor. Patricia stood in the hallway, clutching her designer purse like a shield. She was not alone. Behind her stood Aunt Martha and my father's older brother, Uncle David. They looked grim and determined. I unlatched the deadbolt and pulled the door open a few inches. Before I could even speak, Patricia shoved her weight against the heavy wood, forcing her way into my entryway. David and Martha filed in right behind her, stepping onto my hardwood floors without bothering to wipe their wet shoes. "We are staging an intervention," Patricia announced, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. She dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. "We know you are not in your right mind, Riley. We are here to help you before you do something you will regret for the rest of your life." I crossed my arms and leaned against the console table. "You broke into my apartment to stage an intervention about your federal crimes. That is certainly a bold legal strategy, Patricia." Aunt Martha gasped, clutching her pearl necklace. "Do not speak to your mother that way, Riley. We all know what is really happening here. You are having a mental breakdown. You have always harbored this deep-seated petty sibling rivalry toward Chase, and now you are letting your jealousy destroy the entire Alexander family." Uncle David stepped forward, puffing out his chest. He was a large, imposing man who ran a chain of successful car dealerships, and he was entirely accustomed to bullying women into submission. "Listen to me very carefully, young lady," he barked, pointing a thick finger at my face. "Your father called me in tears this morning. His accounts are frozen. Chase's business is ruined. You're going to log into whatever system you use at that fancy auditing firm of yours, and you are going to reverse this. You are going to clear your brother's name right now." I stared at him with absolute calm. "You cannot reverse a federal subpoena, David." Chase forged my signature on federal loan documents and funneled the money into offshore shell accounts. Patricia and Richard knowingly mortgaged their unencumbered estate to cover his margin calls and hide the fraud. They are going to federal prison. They made a simple mistake. David yelled, his face turning a mottled shade of red. "He is your brother. You protect your blood. I am not going to stand here and let you ruin my nephew's life over a spreadsheet." David scanned my apartment and his eyes locked onto my encrypted work laptop sitting open on the kitchen island. A dangerous light flickered in his eyes. He lunged past me, reaching his massive hands toward the keyboard. "I am deleting these files to save my nephew," he snarled. He did not make it halfway across the kitchen. I shifted my weight and slammed my forearm hard against his chest, blocking his path and forcing him backward. He stumbled, hitting the edge of the sofa. "Do not even think about touching my federal property," I warned, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You have spent your entire life covering up Chase's destructive behavior, David. I remember being 18 years old, standing in our driveway, watching Chase drunkenly smash his imported sports car straight into my parked sedan. You were standing right there. You watched him total the only car I could afford. And you looked the police officer dead in the eye and said I was at fault because I parked it wrong. You protected the golden boy then, and you expect me to fall in line now." David rubbed his chest, breathing heavily. "You are a vindictive, terrible daughter," he sneered. Patricia stepped forward, her fake tears completely evaporating. She glared at me with absolute venom. "We gave you everything, Riley. We gave you a beautiful home. We gave you a prestigious name. And you repay us by tearing our legacy to shreds. You are going to fix this tonight, or I swear to God you will never show your face in our social circles again. You will be dead to everyone who matters." I looked at the three of them standing in my living room, demanding my absolute surrender. They were clinging to the illusion of control, completely unaware that the ground beneath them had already collapsed. "I am already dead to you, Patricia," I replied softly. "I died the day you stole my college fund to pay for Chase's first failed startup. I died the day you let him forge my signature on federal loan documents. You did not come here to save my soul. You came here because your bank accounts are locked, and you are absolutely terrified of losing your country club memberships." Martha pointed a shaking finger at me. "You are a monster, Riley. You are tearing apart a beautiful marriage. Chase and Naya will never recover from the stress you are causing them. You are destroying a family simply because you want to be the center of attention." I opened my mouth to respond, but 3 sharp knocks suddenly echoed. The heavy door swung open, revealing Nia standing in the hallway, perfectly poised and completely unbothered by the pouring rain outside. She was not alone. Flanking her on either side were 2 fully armed uniformed police officers. They stepped into the entryway, their hands resting casually on their duty belts. Nia looked at Patricia, then at David, and finally at Martha. Her lips curled into a cold, brilliant smile that absolutely commanded the room. "I am here to collect my personal belongings," Nia announced, her voice echoing clearly over the sound of the rain. "I have officially filed for divorce." Chase stepped out from the shadowy corridor of my apartment, where he had been silently cowering behind his mother and uncle. His eyes darted nervously between the 2 uniformed officers standing in my entryway, and the thick envelope gripped tightly in his wife's manicured hand. The arrogant swagger he usually carried had completely vanished, replaced by the trembling posture of a cornered animal. He reached out with shaking fingers as Nia closed the distance between them. She did not offer a word of comfort. She simply thrust the heavy envelope directly into his chest, forcing him to take it. "You have officially been served, Chase," she stated, her voice devoid of any warmth. "The officers are here to ensure a peaceful transfer of my assets and to guarantee you do not violate the immediate restraining order I secured this morning." The color drained from Chase's face, leaving him looking fragile. He ripped open the envelope and stared at the legal documents inside. His breathing turned shallow and erratic. "You are abandoning me," he gasped, looking at her with wide, terrified eyes. You are leaving me right now when I am at my absolute lowest. We took vows, Nia. We promised for better or worse. I am losing my company. I am losing my bank accounts. And instead of standing by your husband, you are running away like a coward. You are kicking me while I am down. Patricia rushed forward, placing a protective hand on her son's shoulder. She glared at Nia with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. How dare you? Patricia hissed, her voice trembling with self-righteous fury. How dare you walk away from this marriage when my son needs you the most? You are a selfish gold digger, Nia. You gladly spent his money when times were good, but the second he hits a rough patch, you bring police to humiliate him. Nia did not flinch. She did not raise her voice or defend her character against my mother's accusations. Instead, she calmly reached into her oversized designer tote bag and retrieved 3 identical glossy black folders. She handed the first folder to Patricia. She handed the second folder to Aunt Martha. She shoved the third folder directly into Uncle David's chest. Take a good hard look at your precious golden boy, Nia instructed, her tone dangerously quiet. Look at the brilliant entrepreneur you mortgaged your future to support. Patricia opened the folder with shaking hands. Aunt Martha let out a sharp gasp. Uncle David stared at the glossy photographs inside his thick jaw dropping open in shock. I leaned slightly to my left to catch a glimpse of the top photograph. It showed Chase sitting on the sun deck of a luxury yacht in Miami. He was not alone. A blonde woman wearing a designer bikini was sitting in his lap, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck. The next photograph showed the two of them walking out of a high-end jewelry boutique, carrying multiple shopping bags. I hired a private investigator the morning after Riley mentioned the missing estate tax payments, Nia explained, pacing slowly across my living room floor. I knew something was horribly wrong with our finances. Chase told me he was traveling to Miami and New York to pitch his logistics platform to venture capitalists. He told me he was working 90-hour weeks to build our future. But he was actually spending his time with a 22-year-old fitness influencer named Chloe. Chase opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked physically ill. But it gets so much better, Nia continued, her voice dripping with absolute venom. I had my forensic accountant trace the money he was using to fund these romantic getaways. He did not just use the money you gave him, Patricia. He did not just drain your retirement accounts and leverage the family estate. He used federal Small Business Administration loans. He took hundreds of thousands of dollars in government grants meant for payroll, and he blew it all on chartered yachts, diamond tennis bracelets, and luxury hotel suites for his mistress. Uncle David dropped the folder onto my kitchen island as if it were on fire. He looked at Chase with pure, unadulterated disgust. You stole federal money to pay for a mistress, David growled, his hands curling into tight fists. You absolute fool! Patricia clutched the photographs to her chest, her knees buckling slightly. This has to be a mistake, she sobbed, looking wildly around the room. Chase, tell them this is a lie. Tell them these photos are fake. Chase stared at the hardwood floor, unable to meet his mother's eyes. His silence was the loudest confession in the room. Nia turned her attention back to Chase, delivering the final devastating blow. Because I kept my personal finances completely segregated from your fraudulent business accounts, and because I can definitively prove financial infidelity, the judge granted my emergency injunction. Every single asset in my name is legally protected. I walk away with my savings, my investment portfolios, and my pristine credit score. You walk away with nothing but the clothes on your back and a mountain of federal debt that you can never discharge in bankruptcy. You are drowning, Chase, and I am perfectly happy to watch you sink. The reality of his situation finally crashed down on him. He had lost his wife, his money, his reputation, and his freedom. He spun around and locked his eyes on me, his face twisted into a mask of blind, irrational rage. You did this! He screamed, spittle flying from his lips. You poisoned her mind. You ruined my life. Chase lunged across the living room, throwing his entire body weight toward me with hands outstretched like claws. I did not even have time to brace myself before the 2 police officers reacted. They moved with terrifying speed, tackling Chase from the side and slamming him against my wall. The heavy thud of Chase's body hitting the drywall vibrated through my living room floor. The two veteran police officers did not hesitate for a single second. One twisted Chase's arm sharply behind his back, while the other kicked his legs apart, forcing him to support his weight against the paint. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed loudly over my mother's hysterical scream. Chase thrashed against the officers, completely losing whatever shred of dignity he had left. He shouted that he knew the mayor. He screamed that he was a prominent business owner. The older officer simply yanked him backward by his collar, forcing him to stand upright. "You are under arrest for attempted assault," the officer stated, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "But we are also executing outstanding federal warrants issued this morning for wire fraud and embezzlement of Small Business Administration loans." Patricia dropped to her knees, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. She reached out toward her son, but Uncle David grabbed her shoulder, pulling her back. David was a bully, but he was not stupid enough to interfere with a federal arrest. Nia stood perfectly still, watching her soon-to-be ex-husband dragged toward the door like a common criminal. Chase locked his terrified eyes with me one last time as the officers hauled him out into the hallway. The sheer terror in his gaze was intoxicating. He was finally facing the brutal reality of the real world. By 6 o'clock that evening, the spectacle had escalated from a private family disaster to a spectacular public humiliation. Local news stations thrive on exposing a fallen golden boy from a prominent family. Chase's humiliated mugshot was relentlessly broadcast across every major network in the city. He looked disheveled and terrified, wearing a bright orange county jumpsuit instead of his usual tailored Italian suits. The chyron beneath his face read, "Local Logistics CEO arrested in massive federal fraud sweep." Patricia was sitting in her dark suburban mansion when her phone began to ring. It was not family calling to offer support. It was the wealthy women she called her country club friends. Beatrice, the club president, called to offer her fake sympathies, while carefully inquiring if Patricia would be stepping down from the charity gala planning committee. Two more socialites texted her links to the news broadcast with shocked emojis. Patricia's carefully curated social standing, the absolute most important thing in her entire existence, evaporated in less than 10 minutes. She was no longer the matriarch of a wealthy, successful family. She was the mother of a federal inmate. My phone started ringing at exactly 6:15. Patricia called me 14 times in a row. I let the first 13 calls go to voicemail silently, watching the frantic digital transcripts populate in real time on my computer screen. She was hyperventilating, sobbing uncontrollably, and begging me to answer the phone. On the 15th ring, I finally picked up, placing the phone on speaker and resting it on my kitchen island. "Riley, you have to help us," Patricia wailed, her voice distorted by panic and tears. "The judge set his bail at exactly $500,000. We need $50,000 in cash to get him out tonight. He cannot survive in that violent county jail, Riley. He is not built for it. He is crying. The inmates are threatening him. You have to wire us the cash right this second." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the quartz countertop. I opened a spreadsheet on my laptop and began typing. "Let us do some basic mathematics." "Patricia," I replied, my tone clinical and detached. 13 years ago, you and Richard liquidated my entire college savings account without my permission. You took exactly $50,000. You handed every single cent to Chase so he could rent a flashy office for a startup that failed 6 months later. You stole my education. You forced me to take out high-interest loans and work 50-hour weeks while attending night classes. Patricia gasped loudly. "How can you talk about the past right now? Your brother is in a holding cell." I ignored her interruption, typing the final calculation into my open spreadsheet. "You stole $50,000 from me," I continued. "With 13 years of compound interest at a standard market rate, you actually owe me significantly more. But let us just look at the principal amount." I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch over the phone line. "The cost of his bail is exactly what you stole from me. Ask him to pay it out of his ghost company." I pressed the end call button and blocked her number. I poured a glass of red wine and walked over to my living room window, watching the city lights flicker to life. Across town, Patricia dropped her phone onto the hardwood floor and turned to Richard. My father was pacing the length of their grand foyer, his face slick with nervous sweat. He was holding a stack of financial documents, desperately trying to find a hard money lender willing to overlook the federal freeze on their accounts. He dialed a contact he knew from his old real estate days, praying for a high-interest second mortgage, just to get his son out of a concrete cell. Before the call could even connect, a heavy knock pounded on the mahogany front door. Richard ripped the door open, expecting to see his aggressive brother David returning with a plan. Instead, a uniformed process server stood on the porch holding a thick manila envelope. The courier did not ask for a signature. He simply shoved the certified letter into Richard's chest and walked back to his vehicle. Richard tore the envelope open, his hands shaking violently as he pulled out the official bank documents. It was not a loan approval or a lifeline from an old colleague. The bank was foreclosing on the family estate. The polished glass walls of the downtown conference room offered no privacy, and I preferred it that way. I wanted complete transparency for what was about to unfold. Monday morning sunlight streamed across the massive mahogany table, illuminating the neat stacks of printed financial ledgers I had assembled over the weekend. Sitting directly across from me were 3 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division. Their dark suits and neutral expressions mirrored my own cold professionalism. I plugged my encrypted drive into the presentation screen and projected the tangled web of the Alexander family finances onto the bright digital board. "We are looking at a classic layering scheme," I stated, keeping my voice perfectly even and devoid of any familial hesitation. I clicked a button highlighting a series of shell companies registered in Delaware. Chase Alexander established a primary entity named Apex Logistics. He used this front to apply for federal Small Business Administration loans, claiming 50 phantom employees. The federal grants were deposited into the primary operating account. From there, the funds were immediately fractionalized and routed through these 6 dummy corporations. He generated fake vendor invoices for consulting services to justify the massive outgoing cash flow. Agent Vance, the lead investigator, leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He traced the lines of my digital map with a silver pen. "And where did the fractionalized funds ultimately land?" he asked. I pulled up the next slide, displaying bank statements alongside Miami real estate records and luxury automotive receipts. "The money washed back into personal accounts managed by a third party," I explained. "A 22-year-old fitness influencer named Chloe. She purchased a condominium in cash and secured a chartered yacht lease. The federal payroll funds meant for struggling workers literally bought diamond tennis bracelets and champagne." One of the junior agents frowned, looking at a separate column of numbers. But Apex Logistics kept showing massive liquidity on its quarterly federal audits. How did he maintain the illusion of a solvent company while bleeding it dry? I tapped my keyboard, bringing up the most damning piece of evidence. "This is where Richard and Patricia Alexander enter the equation," I noted, feeling absolutely nothing as I implicated my own parents. When Chase received his first margin call, he panicked. To keep the federal auditors at bay, he needed an immediate capital injection to artificially inflate his corporate balance sheets. My parents took out a $400,000 home equity line of credit against our family estate. I continued tracking the wire transfers on the screen. But they did not just loan him the money personally. Richard Alexander signed as a corporate guarantor, linking his personal estate directly to Apex Logistics. He deliberately transferred those funds into the corporate operating account the day before the federal reporting deadline. He falsified the origin of the capital, categorizing it as legitimate logistics revenue. They knowingly aided the deception to secure the second round of fraudulent government grants. The heavy glass door of the conference room suddenly swung open, breaking the intense concentration in the room. Marcus, my managing partner, strode in, looking deeply uncomfortable. He adjusted his silk tie and glanced nervously at the federal agents. "Riley, we need to pause this presentation immediately." Marcus announced, his voice tight with corporate anxiety. I just reviewed the target subjects of this investigation. You are mapping out indictments against your own brother and your parents. This is a massive ethical violation. I am officially pulling you off this forensic audit due to an extreme conflict of interest. I did not flinch or reach to close my laptop. I simply looked at Agent Vance. The seasoned FBI investigator slowly stood up, his towering frame instantly commanding the space. He looked down at Marcus with a hard, uncompromising glare. You are not pulling anyone off this case, Marcus, the agent stated, his voice rumbling with quiet authority. Your forensic auditor just handed us a perfectly categorized money laundering network, complete with offshore routing numbers and falsified tax returns. She mapped in a single weekend what typically takes my entire division 3 months to untangle. Marcus swallowed hard, shifting his weight defensively. Agent Vance, I understand her work is thorough, but corporate policy dictates that an auditor cannot investigate direct family members. It creates a liability for the firm. Agent Vance slammed his hands down on the table, making the fragile porcelain coffee cups loudly rattle. She is a whistleblower presenting documented federal crimes, he barked. If you attempt to remove her from this room or impede this investigation in any way, I will return this afternoon with a warrant and tear this entire prestigious firm apart looking for obstruction. She absolutely stays right in that chair. Marcus withered under the threat, offering a stiff nod before quickly retreating from the glass room. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing us back into our perfectly sterile environment. I did not waste a single precious second celebrating the remarkably small victory. I immediately returned my eager hands to the black keyboard, projecting the very final financial spreadsheet onto the expansive white wall. Now that we have fully established the corporate guarantee, I said smoothly, we can safely finalize the tax evasion charges. Richard and Patricia Alexander definitely did not ever report the redirected HELOC funds or the subsequent untaxed corporate distributions. Agent Vance smiled a sharp, predatory grin that mirrored my own internal satisfaction. He pulled a thick stack of federal documents from his briefcase and began signing his name across the authorization lines. The Internal Revenue Service loves a documented corporate guarantor, Vance noted, stamping the final page. Because your parents legally tied their personal assets to a fraudulent entity engaged in federal tax evasion, they forfeit all financial protections. I am pushing this to the IRS Enforcement Division right now. They are issuing a massive immediate tax lien against Richard and Patricia. Every single cent of their remaining pensions is entirely wiped out. The heavy concrete walls of the underground parking garage amplified my footsteps. The level was virtually empty at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. I unlocked my vehicle using my key fob, hearing the reassuring double beep echo through the damp air. Before my fingers could pull the door handle, a tall shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar directly behind my car. Chase stepped into the harsh fluorescent light. The tailored suits and perfectly coiffed hair were gone. He wore a wrinkled gray hoodie and jeans that looked like they had been slept in for a week. His eyes were bloodshot, darting frantically. You are going to fix this, he rasped, stepping directly into my path and blocking my access to the driver's side door. I stopped clutching my briefcase. You are violating the terms of your release, Chase, I stated. You are currently out on a bail bond. The judge explicitly ordered you to avoid all contact with the witnesses involved in your federal indictment. I do not care about the judge's orders, Chase spat, taking another step forward. You completely destroyed my life, Riley. My accounts are frozen. Naya changed the locks on our house and filed a restraining order. Mom and Dad are homeless because of your presentation. Do you have any idea what I had to do to get out of that county jail cell? I had to borrow $50,000 from a man who breaks kneecaps for a living. I have 1 week to pay him back or he sends his people. That sounds like a personal financial crisis, I replied, maintaining eye contact. You should probably ask your girlfriend to co-sign a loan for you. Or better yet, sell the diamond tennis bracelets you bought her using stolen federal grants. He lunged forward, grabbing my shoulder. I did not flinch or pull away. I simply stared down at his hand, and then into his eyes. You listen to me, you vindictive little witch! He hissed, his breath hot against my face. You are going to march back up to your fancy glass office right now. You are going to log into your encrypted server, and you are going to alter that forensic audit. You will delete the corporate guarantee connecting mom and dad to my accounts, and you will erase the routing numbers pointing to the offshore shell companies. You will claim it was a software glitch. I will do absolutely no such thing, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. Remove your hand from my jacket. Chase laughed, a hollow, desperate sound that bordered on manic. Oh, you will do exactly what I say, Riley. You think you are so untouchable sitting in your high-rise office playing God with other people's lives? But you are not untouchable. I planned for this. I knew you would be a stubborn obstacle. I hired a specialist on the dark web yesterday. A very expensive, very discreet hacker. He released my shoulder and took a step back, crossing his arms with a sudden burst of manufactured confidence. The hacker is standing by. He continued, a cruel smile stretching across his face. If you do not march back upstairs and alter that audit report tonight, he is going to execute a remote payload. He is going to plant gigabytes of highly illegal child exploitation material directly onto your firm internal network. He will route it to look exactly like it was downloaded and distributed from your specific user terminal. I remained perfectly still, watching him play his desperate hand. They will raid your office by morning. Chase boasted, his voice rising with manic energy. They will seize your computers. They will arrest you in front of all your prestigious colleagues. You will lose your license, your reputation, and your freedom. You will be a convicted felon before the end of the year. Chase stepped closer, leaning in to deliver his final psychological blow. This is exactly who you have always been, Riley. You were always an ugly, friendless loser. You spent your entire childhood hiding in your room studying because nobody wanted to be around you. You never had friends. You never had dates. You are doing this to our family because no one will ever love you, and you want everyone else to be as miserable and alone as you are. You are a pathetic, jealous spinster trying to tear down the people who actually know how to live. Change the audit report, Riley, because if you do not, you will spend the next 20 years rotting in a federal prison. I stared at him, letting the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. I did not scream. I did not defend my appearance or my social life. I simply slowly lifted my right hand and pointed a single manicured finger toward the ceiling directly above his head. Chase frowned and followed my gaze upward. Mounted securely to the concrete beam, perfectly angled to capture our entire interaction, was a high-definition security camera featuring a steadily blinking red light. I am the head of fraud and cybersecurity compliance for a major international accounting firm, Chase. I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute crystal clarity. Those security cameras do not just capture high-definition video. They also record high-fidelity audio directly to an encrypted off-site cloud server that cannot be altered or deleted. You just stood under a live microphone and confessed to hiring a dark web hacker to plant illegal material on a corporate network in order to coerce a federal witness. Chase's face drained of all remaining color, turning a sickly shade of gray. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he stared at the blinking red light. You just committed federal extortion, I concluded smoothly, unlocking my car door. I am forwarding the security footage directly to Agent Vance at the FBI immediately. Enjoy your freedom, Chase. The loan shark is the least of your problems now. The federal tax lien moved with the brutal mechanical efficiency of a guillotine. By Monday morning, the Alexander family estate was officially listed on the county public auction registry. The sprawling 6-bedroom colonial that had served as the ultimate monument to my parents' manufactured status was now just another distressed asset waiting to be liquidated by the bank. Despite the glaring red foreclosure notices taped to the wrought iron front gates, Patricia absolutely refused to acknowledge reality. She retreated into a spectacular state of psychological denial. On a crisp Thursday afternoon, while 3 bank-appointed appraisers meticulously measured the square footage of the mahogany dining room, Patricia was out on the bluestone patio, hosting her weekly afternoon tea party. She sat in a wicker chair, pouring Earl Grey into porcelain cups for 2 bewildered neighbors, chatting brightly about her upcoming summer plans. She completely ignored the men in cheap suits carrying clipboards and laser tape measures who were literally cataloging her antique furniture for auction. She wore a forced, manic smile, acting as if the strangers cataloging her crystal chandeliers were simply hired decorators. She offered them freshly baked scones on a silver platter, which they awkwardly declined before moving on to photograph the custom silk drapery. Her friends sipped their tea in agonizing, terrified silence, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her delusion. Richard, however, possessed no such capacity for delusion. He stood in the grand entryway, his face gray and sunken, watching the lead appraiser document the custom crown molding. The bank gave them exactly 14 days to vacate the premises before the locks were changed and the property was turned over to the federal auction block. The reality of his impending homelessness combined with the total evaporation of his pensions from the IRS tax lien finally broke the patriarch of the Alexander family. His decades of carefully cultivated arrogance dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, desperate man who had entirely run out of options. With Chase facing federal prison, his bank accounts permanently frozen, and Uncle David violently distancing himself from the toxic fallout, Richard had absolutely nowhere else to go. His former country club friends had stopped answering his frantic phone calls. His influential political connections had completely abandoned him overnight. He was entirely isolated, drowning in the catastrophic consequences of his own monumental greed. He had only one place left to turn. 3 hours later, my desk phone buzzed with an urgent notification from the ground floor security desk. The receptionist sounded deeply uncomfortable, whispering that my father was in the lobby causing a scene and refusing to leave. I rode the glass elevator down to the grand atrium of my firm. The lobby was a vast, intimidating space of polished white marble, soaring ceilings, and sharp corporate wealth. Richard stood near the security turnstiles, looking incredibly small. His expensive suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame, and his shoulders were hunched. When he saw me step off the elevator, the last remaining shred of his pride completely vanished. He stumbled forward, tears streaming openly down his weathered face. He did not care that senior partners and federal clients were walking past staring at his public breakdown. He grabbed my arm, his fingers shaking violently. "Riley, please," Richard sobbed, his voice cracking loudly in the cavernous lobby. "You have to help us. The bank is taking the house. They are throwing us out onto the street. You know the senior partners at this firm. You have the money now. You have the leverage. Please just buy the estate from the bank. Put it in your name. We will pay you rent. We will do whatever you want. Just do not let them throw your mother and me out onto the street." I stood perfectly still on the cold marble floor, looking down at the man who had mercilessly ridiculed my ambitions for my entire life. I looked at the tears staining his collar and felt a profound, absolute emptiness. I did not feel pity. I did not feel guilt. I simply felt the heavy weight of poetic justice closing the loop. I gently pried his shaking fingers off my suit jacket. "You are asking me for a massive financial bailout," I stated, my voice echoing clearly off the marble walls. "That is a very interesting request, Richard. Let us rewind the clock to a winter night 9 years ago. I was exactly 22 years old. My landlord had just taped a 3-day pay or quit eviction notice to my apartment door. I was eating instant noodles twice a day because I had entirely drained my bank account paying for the college tuition that you and Patricia stole from me. I stood in your pristine kitchen shivering and begged you for a tiny loan. Just $800 to keep a roof over my head." I leaned in closer, ensuring he heard every single syllable of his own historic cruelty. "You looked at my eviction notice, poured yourself a glass of scotch, and told me that bailing me out would ruin my work ethic. You looked me dead in the eye and said struggle builds character." Richard choked on a sob, his eyes widening in sheer terror as he realized the inescapable trap of his own making. He reached out one last time, a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender, but I was already stepping away from his grasp. I looked at the 3 uniformed security guards watching us closely from the front desk, and then I looked back down at the broken man who had continuously tormented me. "I agree with you, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a sharp, icy whisper. "Struggle builds character. Enjoy the character development." I turned my back and walked straight toward the waiting glass elevator without hesitating. The heavy polished silver doors slid shut with a satisfying echoing metallic click, leaving him completely alone, sobbing uncontrollably on the cold marble floor of the massive corporate lobby. The heavy silver doors of the lobby elevator glided shut instantly, silencing my father's pathetic echoing sobs. I did not look back. I rode the glass cylinder up to the penthouse level of the financial district, transferring to the private express lift that led straight to the rooftop terrace. The evening air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of expensive gin and city rain. Nia was already waiting at a secluded corner table overlooking the illuminated downtown skyline. She looked absolutely radiant, dressed in a sharp emerald blazer that practically screamed financial liberation. A bottle of vintage champagne sat chilling in a condensation-beaded silver bucket beside her. She raised her glass the moment she saw me approach, her dark eyes sparkling with triumphant energy. I took the velvet seat across from her, carefully smoothing the skirt of my tailored suit. We toasted to the official, legally binding finalization of her divorce. She explained exactly how smoothly the proceedings had gone once the family court judge reviewed my forensic accounting evidence. Chase had completely folded. He had absolutely zero clean assets left to fight with, and a massive federal indictment hanging over his head. Nia had walked away with every single investment portfolio she brought into the marriage, plus aggressive punitive damages that effectively liquidated the absolute last of Chase's hidden offshore crypto accounts. We sipped the crisp, freezing champagne, quietly reveling in the absolute destruction of his unearned ego. Nia leaned forward slowly, swirling the golden liquid in her crystal flute. Her expression shifted from celebratory to deeply conspiratorial. She dropped her voice to a low, dangerous whisper over the ambient jazz playing from the terrace speakers. She revealed that her divorce attorney still maintained extensive connections inside the federal courthouse. Through those discreet channels, she had just learned the exact details of Chase's upcoming criminal defense strategy. Chase had apparently secured a notoriously ruthless defense attorney using the very last fraction of a secret digital wallet he had hidden from the federal investigators. The lawyer was absolutely not going to negotiate a standard plea deal based on ignorance or accidental negligence. He was planning to employ a massive scorched earth tactic in the courtroom. Nia smiled a razor-sharp, predatory grin. Chase is throwing Richard and Patricia directly under the bus. She stated her words, cutting through the cool night air. He is officially claiming that he was just a naive, inexperienced figurehead, a dummy puppet controlled entirely by his manipulative parents. His attorney is currently preparing to argue that Richard used his decades of corporate real estate experience to mastermind the entire financial layering scheme. Chase will testify under oath that his parents psychologically manipulated him into signing the Federal Small Business Administration loan documents. He is going to swear on the stand that they relentlessly coerced him into funneling the stolen grant money through the dummy corporations specifically to save their failing expensive country club lifestyle. I set my champagne flute down on the smooth glass table. The sheer unadulterated magnitude of his cowardice was genuinely astounding. Patricia and Richard had literally sacrificed my entire future to fund his endless failures. They had stolen my college fund without a second thought. They had recklessly mortgaged their ancestral home to keep him out of prison. They had lied, stolen, and willingly committed federal tax evasion simply to protect their precious golden boy. And now, the very second he faced actual terrifying consequences, Chase was perfectly willing to send his own mother and father to a federal penitentiary just to shave a few miserable years off his own inevitable prison sentence. I thought about Richard crying in the lobby just 3 hours ago. He had begged me to save them, completely stripped of his arrogant pride, entirely unaware that the son he had worshipped was currently drafting the legal documents that would ensure his parents died behind bars. It was a stunning display of generational rot, finally collapsing under its own weight. I looked out over the glittering city lights, rapidly calculating the legal variables in my mind. The federal pretrial mediation was scheduled for 8 o'clock the following morning, at the downtown courthouse. It was supposed to be a highly classified closed-door session where federal prosecutors would explicitly lay out the charges and offer the respective defense teams a final chance to cooperate before initiating a grueling, highly public trial. Chase would absolutely be there with his expensive shark of an attorney. Richard and Patricia would be sitting at the exact same table with their overworked court-appointed public defender, completely unaware of the lethal knife their beloved son was preparing to plunge directly into their backs to save his own skin. I reached into my structured leather briefcase and pulled out a single heavily redacted sheet of crisp white paper. It was a secondary, highly encrypted corporate ledger I had personally isolated during my very final forensic sweep of the Apex logistics servers. It was a crucial, devastating document that Agent Vance had legally cleared for my personal possession before the federal raid. I stared at the precise columns of black numbers, feeling a profound sense of absolute power surging through my veins. I carefully traced my index finger over the bold signature line, printed cleanly at the absolute bottom of the glossy page. This specific authorization form definitively proved who originated the fraudulent wire transfers. I looked across the table at Nia, sliding the immaculate document back into the dark leather folds of my briefcase. I picked up my crystal glass to finish the last drop of the expensive vintage. I told her that I had a very important morning appointment to attend. I was going to walk straight into that secure federal mediation room and slide this single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany table. It was the exact piece of incontrovertible evidence that would permanently dictate the final prison sentences for all three of them. I smiled. The federal mediation room was a masterpiece of psychological intimidation. It was a perfectly sterile cube located deep within the downtown courthouse. A massive rectangular mahogany table dominated the center of the space, surrounded by black leather chairs. I took my seat at the far end of the table, acting in my official capacity as the lead forensic auditor, representing the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I set my briefcase on the polished wood. Directly across from me sat the bank legal team wearing matching navy suits and bored expressions. To my left sat Richard and Patricia. They looked like hollowed-out shells. Patricia wore a faded beige sweater, her hands trembling violently in her lap. Richard stared blankly at the wood grain, his posture defeated next to their public defender. To my right sat Chase. He looked remarkably composed, having traded his wrinkled hoodie for a crisp charcoal suit. Next to him sat his defense attorney, a sharp-featured man named Sterling. The federal mediator, a stern woman with iron-gray hair, officially opened the session by outlining the devastating scope of the fraud and tax evasion charges. Before she could finish her introductory remarks, Sterling launched his preemptive strike. He stood up and completely detonated the Alexander family dynamic. "My client is fully prepared to cooperate with the federal government," Sterling announced, his voice echoing loudly in the sterile room. "However, we want to make it absolutely clear that Chase Alexander was nothing more than a naive, inexperienced figurehead in this operation. He was systematically manipulated, coerced, and psychologically controlled by the true masterminds of this financial layering scheme, his own parents." A heavy, suffocating silence fell. Patricia stopped trembling and stared at Sterling with her mouth slightly open. Richard Alexander utilized his decades of corporate real estate experience to establish the offshore shell companies. Sterling continued relentlessly pacing behind Chase's chair. Richard and Patricia specifically orchestrated the falsified vendor invoices. They deliberately used their son's name and his logistics company as a shield to secure federal grants because their own credit was completely ruined. They forced him to sign those documents under extreme emotional duress, specifically to maintain their lavish, unsustainable country club lifestyle. Chase is entirely innocent of any malicious intent. Chase sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead and nodding in solemn agreement with his attorney. He was willingly handing his parents a 20-year federal prison sentence without shedding a single solitary tear. The sound of Patricia's shattered reality breaking was horrible to witness. She let out a high-pitched, hysterical gasp that quickly devolved into violent, hyperventilating sobs. She clutched her chest, rocking back and forth in her black leather chair, completely unable to process the magnitude of the betrayal. The golden boy she had idolized, the son she had illegally mortgaged her ancestral home to protect, was actively throwing her directly to the federal wolves to save his own skin. Richard did not cry. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson as the sheer audacity of his son's lies washed over him. The patriarch who had demanded absolute obedience his entire life suddenly snapped. Richard lunged across the polished mahogany table with a guttural roar of rage. He grabbed Chase by the lapels of his expensive charcoal suit, hauling him halfway out of his chair. "You ungrateful little coward!" Richard screamed, spit flying from his lips as he violently shook his son. "We gave you everything. We ruined our lives for you." Chase panicked, batting wildly at his father's hands and shouting for security. The sterile room instantly erupted into absolute chaos. The public defender shouted for Richard to stop, while Sterling threatened immediate assault charges. Two armed federal marshals stationed outside the heavy oak doors rushed into the room, physically prying Richard off his son and shoving him forcefully back into his chair. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table, my hands folded neatly over my briefcase, watching the spectacular implosion of the Alexander family. This was the exact micro-moment that clarified my entire existence. I watched them tear each other apart like starving, vicious animals. They had spent my entire childhood demanding absolute, unwavering loyalty. They had relentlessly preached the sacred, unbreakable bonds of family whenever they needed to justify stealing my resources, diminishing my accomplishments, or demanding my silent obedience. Yet the very second the federal government squeezed them, the moment they faced actual terrifying consequences, that mythical family loyalty completely evaporated. They possessed absolutely no core values. They were just greedy cowards wearing expensive clothes. The federal marshals stood behind Richard's chair, forcing order back into the tense, sterile environment. Patricia continued to sob into her hands, completely broken. Chase straightened his tie, refusing to look at his parents. The lead attorney for the bank, a tall, intimidating man with wire-rimmed glasses, slowly stood up, buttoned his tailored suit jacket, and cleared his throat loudly, demanding the room's absolute attention. He looked down at a thick stack of financial documents before making a highly irregular announcement. "The federal prosecutor has indicated a willingness to negotiate the severity of these criminal charges," the bank attorney stated, his voice cutting through the lingering tension. "The government is potentially willing to recommend probation rather than federal prison time for all three defendants. However, there is one non-negotiable stipulation. The massive civil debt, including the fraudulently obtained loans and the subsequent tax liens, must be completely satisfied and liquidated today. If the debt is paid, the prison sentences go away." The room fell completely silent. Richard and Patricia were bankrupt. Chase's hidden accounts had been wiped out by his divorce. They did not have a single dollar left between them to pay the massive settlement that would secure their permanent freedom. The bank attorney slowly looked up from his paperwork, directly meeting my eyes across the table. "But the question remains," the attorney said, adjusting his glasses, staring directly at me. "Who exactly owns the debt?" The bank attorney took a deliberate step backward, melting into the shadows and completely yielding the floor to me. The heavy silence in the mediation chamber was suffocating. Every single eye locked onto my hands as I reached into my structured black briefcase. I slowly unfastened the polished brass clasps, allowing the sharp metallic clicks to echo loudly off the walls. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy leather-bound contract, dropping it squarely onto the mahogany table. The dull thud made Patricia physically flinch in her seat. Sterling immediately bristled, sensing the dramatic shift in the power dynamic. He slammed his hand down on the table, glaring at me with absolute contempt. "What exactly is this?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "You are a forensic auditor contracted by the federal government to review corporate ledgers. You have absolutely no legal standing in civil debt collection or bank negotiations. This entire mediation process is highly irregular, and I demand to know why an examiner is presenting civil documents in a federal criminal proceeding. I did not even blink at his aggressive posturing. I looked at the federal mediator sitting at the head of the table. She stared back with a perfectly neutral expression and offered a single curt nod, granting me explicit permission to hold the floor. I turned my attention back to Sterling and his panicked client. I am presenting this document because the bank no longer has any financial stake in this conversation. I stated my voice perfectly, even and devoid of any emotion. When a commercial bank discovers a massive network of fraudulent loans tied to toxic assets, they do not waste years litigating in civil court. They immediately cut their losses to protect their corporate balance sheets. They bundle the defaulted loans, the leveraged home equity lines of credit, and the subsequent tax penalties into a single distressed portfolio. Then they quietly sell that toxic portfolio to aggressive private equity firms for pennies on the dollar. Richard slowly looked up, his eyes widening with a sudden, desperate glimmer of comprehension. He understood corporate finance. He knew what a distressed debt sell-off meant. Exactly 3 days ago, the bank officially packaged the entire Alexander family debt portfolio. I continued tracing the edge of the leather-bound contract with my index finger. They bundled the fraudulent Small Business Administration loans. Chase secured the massive $400,000 home equity line of credit Richard signed over to Apex Logistics, and all the corresponding corporate penalties. A completely anonymous private equity group swooped in and purchased that entire debt portfolio at a massive aggressive discount. The bank has been made whole. They have officially washed their hands of your client's pathetic fraudulent mess. Chase furrowed his brow, clearly struggling to calculate how this structural shift affected his criminal defense strategy. "But that is good, right?" he whispered, leaning toward Sterling. "If a faceless private equity firm bought the debt, we can negotiate a standard structured settlement. We can offer them a payment plan or file for corporate bankruptcy to restructure the principal amount. They just want a return on their investment. They do not care about sending us to federal prison." I watched the pathetic bloom of false hope wash over Chase's face. I watched Richard straighten his posture slightly suddenly, believing that his decades of corporate negotiation tactics might actually save him from the absolute destruction of his family. They both still genuinely believed they could manipulate their way out of the corner. They still believed they were the smartest men in the room. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I withdrew 2 sleek, matte black business cards featuring embossed silver lettering. I placed my fingertips on the edges and slid the first card across the polished mahogany table, letting it stop perfectly in front of Chase. I slid the second card directly toward Richard. "You are operating under a massive fundamental misconception, Chase," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, icy whisper that commanded the absolute silence of the room. "You are assuming the private equity group that bought your debt is a faceless corporate entity looking for a standard return on investment. You are assuming they are willing to negotiate a polite, reasonable settlement. Read the card." Chase slowly reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the matte black card. His bloodshot eyes scanned the embossed silver text. His jaw dropped open, and all the remaining color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. Richard snatched his card off the table, adjusting his reading glasses with violently shaking hands. "Apex Vantage Equity Partners," one announced into the dead silence, reciting the text printed on the card. "Riley Alexander, sole managing partner." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the heavy leather-bound contract. I did not just audit the bank Chase. I used my own legitimate personal wealth to build a shadow portfolio over the last 5 years. I utilized the exact same financial intelligence you mocked to establish a highly aggressive private equity firm. And 3 days ago, I personally authorized the complete unconditional buyout of your entire toxic financial existence. I bought the fraudulent corporate loans. I bought the home equity line of credit. I bought the mortgage on the family estate. Patricia let out a strangled, horrified gasp, pressing both hands over her mouth as the absolute reality of my words crashed down upon her. I am not just the forensic auditor who mapped your federal crimes, I concluded, staring directly into my father's terrified, widening eyes. I am the sole managing partner of the equity group holding your debt. I personally own your loans. I personally own your mortgages. I own every single cent of your miserable financial lives. And I am the only human being on this earth who holds the power to sign the civil satisfaction release that will keep you out of a dark federal penitentiary. The silence inside the federal mediation room became absolutely suffocating. Richard stared at the embossed silver lettering on the matte black business card as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The words, Apex Vantage Equity Partners, burned into his retinas. Below that corporate title, my name sat in pristine, unapologetic print. Sole Managing Partner. His brain simply could not process the information. For decades, he had controlled every single narrative. He had mocked my accounting degree as a pathetic safety net for a boring loser. He had constantly paraded Chase around as the undisputed financial genius of the Alexander family. Now the terrifying reality crashed down upon him with the force of a collapsing building. The daughter he had relentlessly discarded was a multimillionaire operating a shadow equity firm capable of swallowing his entire existence in one single transaction. The aggressive alpha male patriarch who had lunged across the mahogany table just minutes ago completely withered. His broad shoulders slumped forward heavily, and a sudden sickly gray pallor washed right over his face. He dropped the business card, as if it were physically burning his fingers, and collapsed back into his black leather chair. He was completely and utterly ruined beyond any possible doubt. Patricia experienced a completely different psychological fracture. Her mind, entirely incapable of comprehending her own destruction, instantly manufactured a wild, desperate delusion. Her eyes darted wildly between the heavy leather-bound contract on the table and my perfectly calm face. The sheer terror in her chest morphed into a twisted, hysterical relief. She let out a breathless, ragged sound that was half sob and half laugh. In her deeply narcissistic reality, there was only one possible explanation for this revelation. I had spent my hidden fortune to rescue them. I had bought the toxic debt to shield the family name from public ruin. Patricia slid out of her chair. Her legs gave way, and she dropped heavily to the industrial carpet of the federal courthouse, ruining her sheer nylons. She did not care. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, weeping openly. Her beige sweater slipped off her shoulder as she crawled frantically around the side of the massive mahogany table. She reached out with trembling, manicured hands, desperately trying to grab the hem of my tailored skirt. Riley, my baby, she wept, gazing up at me with smeared mascara and wild, pleading eyes. You bought the debt to save us. I knew you loved us. I knew you would never let them take our home. You saved the family. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire childhood treating me like an unwanted burden. I watched her crawl on the floor, begging for salvation from the very daughter she had sacrificed to fund my brother's endless failures. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I took a deliberate, calculated step backward, completely removing myself from her frantic grasp. Her hands grasped empty air, and she slumped forward against the polished wood of the table leg. I looked directly into her tear-streaked face and smiled a razor-thin, terrifying smile. I did not buy it to save you. I stated, my voice echoing like cracking ice in the sterile room. I bought it to liquidate it. I turned away from her pathetic sobbing form and looked down at the thick leather-bound contract resting on the table. I reached inside my suit jacket and withdrew a heavy gold fountain pen. I unscrewed the cap with slow, methodical precision. This specific document is the immediate unconditional foreclosure authorization for the Alexander family estate. I announced, locking eyes with Richard as I positioned the pen over the signature line. It also authorizes the immediate seizure of all remaining corporate assets, pension distributions, and personal bank accounts tied to the fraudulent collateral. You have absolutely nothing left. I pressed the gold nib to the crisp white paper and signed my name with a fluid, elegant flourish. The finality of the signature sealed their total financial ruin. Patricia wailed, burying her face in her hands on the floor. Richard stared straight ahead, completely paralyzed by the utter devastation of his legacy. The bank attorney silently packed his briefcase, acknowledging the structural shift in power. The federal mediator watched the scene with professional detachment, waiting for my next move. The heavy oak doors of the room remained firmly shut, locking the family inside this tomb of their own making. Sterling looked down at his legal pad, realizing that his brilliant defense strategy had just been completely obliterated by a phantom portfolio. This was the exact end of the Alexander dynasty. I simply smiled very coldly. I capped my fountain pen and slipped it back into my pocket. I slowly turned my attention to the right side of the table, where my brother sat in terrified silence. Chase had been watching the entire exchange with wide, unblinking eyes. He had genuinely believed that sacrificing our parents would grant him a clean escape. He had foolishly relied on the bank to accept a negotiated settlement to avoid federal prison. I walked around the edge of the mahogany table, stopping directly behind his chair. I leaned down, placing both of my hands flat on the polished wood, trapping him in his seat. He shrank away from me, sweating profusely in his expensive charcoal suit. "You thought you could just throw them under the bus and walk away," I whispered, my voice barely carrying over. Patricia's continued sobbing on the floor. "You thought your expensive lawyer could negotiate a comfortable probation deal with a faceless corporate entity." I leaned closer until I was inches from his ear. "But you are not negotiating with a faceless entity anymore, Chase. I am the sole managing partner of Apex Vantage Equity Partners. I own every single fraudulent loan you ever signed. And as your primary creditor, I am formally denying the debt settlement offer. Enjoy federal prison, Chase." 2 weeks later, the biting chill of a Tuesday morning in late November swept across the manicured lawns of the Alexander estate. The sprawling brick colonial that had stood for decades as the ultimate monument to my parents' manufactured superiority was completely swarming with heavily armored private security contractors and uniformed moving personnel. I stood at the end of the long, sweeping driveway, holding a steaming cup of black coffee, and simply watched the beautiful, systematic dismantling of their entire fraudulent reality. Two massive white transport trucks idled loudly on the pristine cobblestones, their exhaust plumes rising thick and gray into the freezing morning air. The heavy oak front doors of the estate were propped wide open, allowing the cold wind to sweep directly through the grand foyer. Men in heavy work boots marched methodically in and out, carrying boxes of expensive china, rolled up Persian rugs, and carefully wrapped oil paintings. This was not a standard foreclosure. This was a total corporate liquidation. Every single asset inside that house belonged to Apex Vantage Equity Partners, and I was overseeing the extraction of my property. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter warmth ground me in the reality of the moment. The sheer scale of their accumulated material greed was genuinely staggering. I walked slowly up the driveway, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my structured leather boots. Over by the detached three-car garage, Richard was hunched over the open trunk of a severely rusted, beat-up gray sedan. It was a 20-year-old economy model I had specifically arranged through a low-tier rental agency to serve as their sole permitted means of transportation. His beloved imported luxury vehicles had been seized and towed away by federal agents 10 days ago. Richard wore a faded gray tracksuit, looking a decade older than he had in the mediation room. He was frantically shoving black plastic trash bags filled with his remaining permitted personal effects into the cramped trunk. His face was a tight mask of suppressed rage and total humiliation. He refused to look at me as I approached. The man who had spent his entire life dominating boardrooms and demanding absolute reverence from everyone in his orbit was now reduced to fighting with a jammed trunk latch on a worthless vehicle. He grunted loudly, slamming his fist against the rusted metal in a pathetic display of impotent fury. I walked right past him without uttering a single word, stepping through the grand entrance. The interior of the house was echoing with chaos. I found Patricia in the formal dining room standing directly beneath the massive imported crystal chandelier that had always been her ultimate pride and joy. She was physically blocking two burly movers from setting up their scaffolding, her arms flailing wildly as she screamed at the top of her lungs. "You absolutely cannot take this!" she shrieked, her voice hoarse and cracking with hysteria. "It is a certified European antique. It has been in this family for 3 generations. You common thugs have absolutely no right to touch my property." I stepped into the doorway, folding my arms across my chest. The movers looked at me, seeking direction. Patricia snapped her head toward me, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She looked unhinged. Her perfect blonde hair was matted and unwashed, and she wore a stained silk bathrobe over a pair of wrinkled sweatpants. "Riley, tell these absolute animals to leave my chandelier alone," she demanded, stomping her foot on the hardwood floor like a petulant toddler. "It belongs to me. It is my heritage." I shook my head slowly, signaling the movers to proceed. "It belongs to the corporate estate, Patricia." I corrected, my voice echoing coldly in the increasingly empty room. "You legally forfeited your right to heritage the exact second you forged my name to secure your fraudulent corporate loans. The chandelier goes into the auction inventory with the rest of the imported fixtures." The movers immediately bypassed her, setting up their aluminum ladders and beginning the extraction process. Patricia watched them detach the crystal teardrops, her hands shaking violently. She slowly turned back to me, her expression twisting from desperate pleading into pure, unadulterated hatred. All the maternal pretense she had ever faked completely vanished, revealing the absolute toxic rot underneath. "You are a cold, heartless bitch," she spat, the venom dripping from every single syllable. "You have completely destroyed your own family. You sent your brother to a federal cage, and you are throwing us onto the street. You will die alone, Riley. No one will ever love a monster like you." I stood perfectly still, absorbing the absolute worst she had to offer. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I just smiled, a very gentle, genuinely peaceful smile. "I would much rather die entirely alone than spend one single minute living with parasites," I replied, my voice completely devoid of anger. The absolute finality of the statement struck her like a physical blow. She staggered backward, leaning against the dining room wall as the movers lowered her precious chandelier to the floor. 30 minutes later, the eviction was fully complete. I stood on the sweeping front porch and watched Richard and Patricia climb into the beat-up gray sedan. The engine sputtered and whined before finally catching. They drove slowly down the long cobblestone driveway, heading toward the cramped, low-income apartment block on the outer city limits designated as their new permanent residence. They did not look back. The moment their rusted sedan turned onto the main road, a sleek, brand-new silver Porsche glided up the driveway. It was the exact custom model Chase had originally tried to buy before the federal indictment froze his hidden digital wallets. The expensive sports car purred to a halt directly in front of the porch. The driver's side door swung open, and Nia stepped out, wearing a crimson trench coat and a victorious smile. Nia rolled down the tinted window of the gleaming silver Porsche and offered me a sharp, victorious salute before accelerating down the street, leaving the empty, foreclosed estate completely silent behind us. 3 weeks later, that exact same heavy, suffocating silence filled the federal courtroom. The space was a cavernous expanse of polished oak and green marble, designed to make defendants feel incredibly small. I sat in the second row of the gallery, wearing a tailored navy suit, my hands folded calmly in my lap. Directly in front of me, Chase sat at the defense table next to Sterling. Chase had lost weight. The arrogant swagger that had defined his entire existence was completely gone, replaced by rigid, sweating terror. Judge Harrison, a notoriously unforgiving federal magistrate, shuffled a thick stack of financial documents on her elevated bench. She adjusted her steel glasses and looked down at my brother with absolute, unadulterated disgust. The federal prosecutor stood at the adjacent table, radiating quiet confidence. The pretrial mediation had failed spectacularly the moment I denied the civil debt settlement. Without that financial restitution, the prosecutor had absolutely zero incentive to offer leniency. Sterling had attempted a last-minute plea deal, offering to surrender corporate assets that Chase no longer even owned. The judge had seen straight through the pathetic maneuver. Mr. Alexander Judge Harrison began, her voice echoing loudly through the modern sound system. I have presided over federal financial crimes for 2 decades. I have seen corporate greed, systemic embezzlement, and complex money laundering. However, the sheer arrogance and cowardly malice displayed in this specific case is genuinely astounding. You did not just defraud a commercial bank or exploit federal grant programs. You systematically stole the identity of your own sister, using her pristine credit and professional standing to shield your own reckless incompetence. You manipulated the system, extorted your family, and attempted to leave an innocent woman holding the bag for your catastrophic failures. Chase swallowed hard, his throat bobbing erratically against his stiff white collar. He cast a desperate, pleading look over his shoulder, locking eyes with me. I did not blink. I offered absolutely no comfort, no reassurance, and no forgiveness. I just stared back with the cold, calculating precision of an auditor examining a bankrupt ledger. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, her tone dropping to a lethal, icy register. You actively attempted to lay the blame for your criminal enterprise entirely on your parents during the mediation phase. You showed absolutely no remorse, no accountability, and no basic human decency until you were backed into a corner by the private equity buyout of your debt. The court notes that the civil debt remains entirely unsatisfied, making you a severe flight risk and an ongoing threat to the financial community. Sterling placed a warning hand on his arm, urging him to remain perfectly still. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom remained firmly shut. Richard and Patricia were nowhere to be seen. They were currently navigating the brutal reality of the public transit system from their cramped, low-income apartment across the city, completely unable to afford the parking fees downtown, to watch their golden child receive his final judgment. Please stand, Mr. Alexander, Judge Harrison commanded. Chase rose slowly, his knees visibly knocked together. The expensive charcoal suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame. On the charge of aggravated identity theft, I sentence you to 2 years in a federal penitentiary. The judge read, her voice ringing with absolute finality. On the charge of systemic wire fraud, I sentence you to 5 years to be served consecutively. On the charge of corporate extortion, I sentence you to 1 year also to be served consecutively. Chase Alexander, you are hereby remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals Service to serve a total of 8 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Chase let out a breathless, strangled gasp. His knees completely buckled, and Sterling had to physically catch him by the bicep to keep him from collapsing onto the polished hardwood floor. 2 heavily armed federal marshals immediately stepped forward from the shadows of the jury box. They flanked my brother, firmly grabbing his arms and spinning him around to face the gallery. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting around his wrists echoed like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. As the marshals forcefully marched him down the center aisle, Chase stopped struggling. He locked eyes with me one final time. In that fleeting moment, the thick veil of his lifelong delusion finally shattered. I watched the agonizing realization wash over his pale, sweating face. He finally understood. Every single time he had mocked my accounting textbooks, every time he had stolen my savings to fund his vacations, every time he had shoved me into the background, while demanding the spotlight, he had not been breaking me. He had been forging me. Every insult, every stolen dollar, every arrogant dismissal had acted as a whetstone, slowly and methodically, sharpening the exact blade I had just used to completely sever him from society. He had built his own executioner. I held his gaze until the marshals shoved him through the heavy side doors, disappearing into the dark holding cells of the federal justice system. I stood up, smoothed the skirt of my tailored navy suit, and walked out of the courtroom. The heavy brass doors clicked shut behind me, sealing away the last remaining echo of the Alexander family dynasty. I rode the elevator down to the lobby and stepped out onto the wide marble steps of the courthouse. I breathed. The crisp, freezing winter air filled my lungs, tasting like absolute unadulterated freedom. The toxic, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for 30 years was completely gone. I owned my own life. I owned my own future. As I began to walk down the steps toward the bustling city street, my phone vibrated violently. The sharp vibration of my phone shattered the crisp silence of the winter afternoon. I paused on the bottom step of the courthouse and pulled the device from my coat pocket. The screen displayed text messages from an unsaved number. I instantly recognized the panicked cadence of my mother's typing. She just realized the federal sentence was completely real. I did not read the text. I powered the device down, letting the screen reflect the clouds overhead. I slid the phone back into my pocket, buttoned my cashmere coat against the wind, and stepped seamlessly into the bustling city traffic. I was finally walking away for good. Exactly 1 year later, the bitter cold of that courthouse memory was replaced by the radiating heat of a massive stone fireplace. I stood in the center of Nia's breathtaking new living room, gently swirling a flute of vintage champagne. The modern home nestled in the wooded hills was a masterpiece of warm lighting and towering windows looking out into the snow. It was the exact opposite of the sterile, intimidating brick colonial I had been forced to call home. The ambient noise of genuine laughter and overlapping conversations filled the expansive room. We were hosting our holiday dinner, but the guest list was strictly curated. There were no toxic blood relatives demanding performative gratitude. I looked across the room and watched Nia holding court by the kitchen island. She looked absolutely radiant in an emerald green silk dress, effortlessly balancing a plate of appetizers while telling an animated story to my lead financial analyst. Nia had taken the capital salvaged from Chase's accounts and launched her consulting firm. In 12 months, she had built a client roster that rivaled anything my brother ever attempted to manage. She was no longer the quiet accessory expected to blindly fund a narcissist's delusions. She was a powerhouse in her own right. Our chosen family filled every corner of the house. The aggressive professionals who helped me build Apex Vantage Equity Partners were laughing on the sofas. The mentors who had guided me through my grueling accounting exams when my father refused to pay my tuition were sharing vintage wine by the bay windows. Every single person in this room had earned their place through mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and genuine kindness. They did not care about the toxic legacy of corporate extortion. They cared about the woman who had built an empire from the absolute scraps she had been thrown. I took a slow, appreciative sip of my champagne, letting the crisp bubbles wash over my tongue. I felt a profound, unshakable sense of peace. For the first time in 32 years, I was not bracing for an impact. I was simply existing in a reality I had built. Then a sharp, familiar chime sliced through the ambient noise. My phone lit up on the polished mahogany console table right beside my hip. I set my champagne glass down and picked up the device. The screen displayed a harsh, glowing notification from a completely unknown number. I unlocked the screen and opened the message. "Dad is sick." The message began plunging immediately into a chaotic narrative of misery. His heart gave out last week. The doctors say he needs immediate specialized surgery, but the state insurance will not cover the out-of-network providers. We are completely out of options, Riley. The apartment is freezing, and we cannot afford basic utility bills, let alone these massive medical expenses. We have absolutely nothing left. Please, you are our only daughter. We need you. I stood perfectly still in the warm, glowing light of Nia's living room, reading the words over and over again. You are our only daughter. The absolute, unmitigated audacity of that specific sentence was staggering. For 3 decades, I had been the invisible spare part. I had been the designated scapegoat for every single one of Chase's failures. I was only considered their daughter now because their golden child was wearing a neon orange jumpsuit in a federal penitentiary. I was only their daughter because their fraudulent bank accounts were completely drained. They did not want a relationship. They wanted a rescue. I slowly looked up from the glowing screen. Across the room, Nia caught my eye. She threw her head back, laughing brightly at a joke someone made, the firelight catching the gold jewelry at her throat. She was living her absolute best life, completely free of the parasites that had tried to drain her dry. I looked back down at the screen. Patricia was currently waiting in some cramped, freezing, low-income apartment, desperately hoping that decades of ingrained familial guilt would magically override my basic sense of self-preservation. She was hoping the obedient little girl she had conditioned to accept her abuse would suddenly rush to save the patriarch who had orchestrated my total erasure. I raised my thumbs to the digital keyboard. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I did not feel any lingering resentment or vindictive triumph. I felt absolutely nothing for them. They were simply strangers who shared my DNA. They had made their choices, and now they were experiencing the natural, unshielded consequences of a lifetime of unparalleled greed. I typed my response with precise keystrokes. Try Uber. No worries. I hit send. Before the delivery receipt could register on the screen, I opened the contact settings and permanently blocked the number. I locked the screen and casually tossed the phone onto the plush cushions of the nearby velvet sofa. I picked up my crystal flute of vintage champagne and turned my back on the console table forever. I walked directly toward the roaring fireplace toward Nia and the brilliant, vibrant family I had chosen for myself. The heavy, oppressive ghosts of my past simply ceased to exist, evaporating into the crisp winter night. I raised my glass to the room and a genuine, unburdened smile finally spread across my face. The profound narrative of Audrey's exclusion from her family's annual retreat highlights a devastating but ultimately liberating truth about toxic family dynamics. For 15 years, the retreat had been a cherished tradition, yet Audrey found herself suddenly uninvited, purportedly because there was not enough space. The heartbreaking reality was that her family had deliberately excluded her for being a divorced single woman whose struggles threatened their curated image of perfection, even going so far as to invite her cheating ex-husband in her place. From this painful betrayal emerges a vital life lesson: when people refuse to make space for you, you possess the absolute power to create your own. Audrey's initial reaction was understandably one of deep devastation and grief. Family is often culturally positioned as an unconditional sanctuary, so being discarded by the very people supposed to offer support during vulnerable times is a profound trauma. Her parents and siblings used inclusion as a tool for control, punishing her for failing to maintain a facade of a flawless marriage and career. However, the story demonstrates that accepting a victim role is not the only option. Guided by her friend's advice, Audrey realized that begging for a place among people who did not value her would only reinforce their toxic power dynamic. Instead of shrinking into the background, Audrey took control of her own narrative. By renting the luxurious Lakeview estate directly adjacent to her family's resort and inviting a chosen circle of supportive, successful friends, she firmly refused to be erased. She did not orchestrate this as an act of petty revenge, but rather as a profound reclamation of her dignity and self-worth. This strategic move teaches us a universal truth: we do not have to accept the diminished roles assigned to us by others. We have the agency to redefine our surroundings and surround ourselves with individuals who celebrate our authenticity rather than our compliance. The most striking takeaway is how Audrey's self-created space ultimately outshone the restrictive environment of her biological family. Her estate became a magnet for extended family members who were drawn to the genuine warmth, fun, and acceptance she cultivated, standing in stark contrast to the tense, image-obsessed atmosphere next door. She proved that true family is not strictly defined by shared DNA or rigid performative obligations. Instead, family is defined by mutual respect, unwavering love, and the willingness to make space for one another, especially during life's most challenging seasons. Ultimately, Audrey's journey from a heartbroken outcast to an empowered architect of her own happiness is a testament to human resilience. She learned that standing up for oneself does not require explosive anger. It simply requires refusing to accept a false narrative. If you have ever been forced to build your own sanctuary because others closed their doors on you, take a moment to share your story of reclaiming your power. Comment below.